Alright, what's up, boys? I got a lot of questions really fast on the last one, so I guess I'm already doing the next question and answer. A lot of really, really good questions, so I appreciate it. Um, Definitely some good technical questions that I think I can impart some like useful training knowledge, because that's always kind of like, I kick myself when I watch them. I'm like, this isn't really like actionable advice, because I always got super fucking frustrated when I was first starting to get into lifting. I would get all these general platitudes from like YouTube videos where they're like, oh, don't go too heavy, but don't go too light. I'm like, well, fuck, what does that mean? And I want to just like give me like some specific something to work with, or just something that like actually like what does that mean in practical application. So I always kick myself when I'm kind of speaking in platitudes because I don't like to be wrong. But I'll try to give more and more just because I know that's what people are looking for. Bear with me if they're not like a one size fits all answer always. Once again, if you have any questions you would like my opinion on, leave them in the comments of this video. Now to get into the questions. So, can you get really strong eating like crap all the time? Yes, but you won't be very healthy. You can, if you blow up and get obese, you will be pretty damn strong. It's just not necessarily the most long-term sustainable approach. And generally speaking, the person who makes the most progress in 2 years isn't necessarily the one who's going to be the strongest in 10, whether it be through drug use or excessive weight gain or overly aggressive training per se. Oftentimes, the person who makes the most progress in those 2 years is using an unsustainable approach and will either be injured or burnt out come the 10-year mark. So the person who isn't slacking, this isn't to say like, oh, you should be okay with mediocre progress because everyone else is going to quit. It's going to say the guy that had the relatively smart approach come 10 years down the line will probably be stronger, just because you'll see so many flash in the pan, like huge explosions of strength, even like locally or on the like international powerlifting scene. You'll see people get really strong really fast, hurt themselves, and be gone. If you can avoid being one of those people, you'll probably end up being stronger than they were at the end of their like flash in the pan strength gain. So that would be my answer. At what point does nutrition become very important for progress? Or can everyone still progress even if they eat junk food every day, considering they get optimal sleep, cardio, good programming? Well, Paul, I don't understand why you would do that. Like, if you care about it, why not dial in all the variables except for all but one? Why do what you can get away with instead of doing what you should do? That being said, especially if you're okay with just being obese, you can get very, very strong following a shit diet. You just have to make sure you're getting enough protein within your shit diet, and covering your bases with like micronutrients. But if you eat a bunch of Twinkies after your beef, like, you can get pretty strong. You can feel like shit though. Thoughts on double underhand deadlifts? Don't do them. Yes, double underhand, not double overhand. Is performing these asking for an injury? Yes. Never heard of those before. Yeah, it's putting your bicep in a very bad position. I would say it's definitely jacking up your injury risk. It's less efficient to lift from. Your friend says he can lock in his back better that way. Just learn how to do it double overhand or mixed grip. I mean, no, don't do that. Bad idea. There's a reason you don't see anybody doing those. Do you think some people are at their strongest when they feel beat up at times during programs, or they feel more fresh? Okay, so speaking generally, everybody's at their strongest when they're feeling semi-fresh. Once you decay whatever fatigue you have built up, you're going to be able to express the most strength, right? You don't want to decay the fatigue so long that you start detraining, right? So, it might be only a couple of days of rest to deload rather than a whole week or two, especially because natural athletes will start the detraining process a little quicker. That being said, in this specific question, depends on how your program is laid out. It might be that you're actually at your strongest. You also happen to be banged up. It's not because you're banged up that you're stronger. It's just that's how your program works out. Mine is largely that way because I never fully deload prior to working up to singles, just because I like to remain like building, and I don't really care to maximally express my strength as long as I'm getting better. So displaying strength under a certain amount of fatigue is just kind of what I do. So I guess I am at my strongest when I'm beat to shit, but that's not like a physiological thing. That's just how my program is set up. Are sets of 15 to 20 plus on compound movements beneficial for powerlifting? Well, if you mean by compound movements the competition motions, absolutely not. I would say that's not really the best use of time, though some people have made good work out of 20 rep sets on bench or squat. That being said, if you just mean any compound movement, I think that taking your more hypertrophy focused exercises into those rep ranges can be extremely beneficial, right? So obviously we're working on our strength skill in the primary. That's the meat and potatoes of the workout, but we also have accessories, and presumably your accessories are to keep you healthy and to maximize your hypertrophy of the primary movers, right? And so the approach that I've always subscribed to maximize hypertrophy is kind of like the old Dorian Yates style, like trained by JP does. All those guys kind of follow this like aggressive beat the book styles where if you improve your strength across all rep ranges, lower reps, middle reps, if you improve your strength in the 8 to 12 range, and then also in the 10 to 20 range, and then maybe like one every now and then throwing in a set of 20 to 30 for like metabolite build-up drivers of hypertrophy. If you improve your strength in all of those and you're providing your body with the requisite like building blocks, you are going to grow like a motherfucker. So, in some motions do lend themselves to those higher rep ranges. Like I find lat pull downs in the 15 to 20 range do a lot better for me than taking them in the traditional 8 to 12 range for hypertrophy. So yeah, it's like comes down to strengthening a muscle across a wide variety of rep ranges is probably the best way to drive growth in my opinion, rather than sticking to a singular rep range, because you can be able to target different muscle fibers preferentially. You can take advantage of metabolic drivers of hypertrophy. So because those have been shown that like metabolite buildup in your muscles just from exercising, right? The metabolites that build up can drive hypertrophy independent from the mechanical tension model of driving hypertrophy that we're all familiar with. So yeah, I absolutely will program those, especially certain motions I find lend themselves to those rep ranges better than lower rep ranges, such as like tricep press downs, lat pull downs. Those I've never felt were overly beneficial to do like a heavy set of 10 on, because I can do on a tricep press down, for example, I could do the whole stack plus a 45. I could still do more than 10 reps. So it's like practically speaking, if I want to take a set within a reasonable proximity of failure, I'm going to have to do higher reps. But even if I had the right amount of weight and wouldn't lift myself off the ground, I would still prefer to train the higher reps just because I found better results from it. How many years of experience did you have coaching yourself before you started coaching other people? Was Max the first person you coached? You'd think so, but no. I just when I first started, me and some friends started going to the gym. I was the only one that found the program side of lifting relatively interesting, so pretty quickly I just kind of started taking over their programming. Just telling them like, hey, you guys should probably do this, because I was spending all my time reading and watching videos and learning about it. They weren't, and they're like, hey Sam, you know a little bit about this, could you do it for me? And I was like, yeah, sure. Why not? And that kind of expedited my ability to learn. So I started coaching people very, very quickly. Not to say I was a good coach, I was just kind of helping out my friends, very different. And then I coached people for free for, I believe, 4 years before I started charging for it, just because it is something that I'm passionate about and I enjoy doing to some degree. Max, actually, I didn't start coaching him until about a year into his training. Kind of helped him out initially. I guess I coached him initially. And then I was worried that I did not know enough to do a good enough job with a young athlete, because I had never worked with a young athlete. So I shipped him off to be coached by my friend Winston. He did their program for a while, and eventually he hopped back on my program. And that's kind of how that happened. Is your programming mostly based off of RPE or percentages, and why? Okay, so that's a hard one to explain. Speaking generally, it's working mostly off of like rough percentages, but I watch everybody's sets to pick the following week's weights. So it's not really either. I'm hand picking the weights for everybody I coach based on watching their video and how it looked to me. But that being said, I do definitely roughly follow a percentage progression. The reason I do that is because I think that, telling people they need to do a certain number is often necessary for newer people, because they don't understand the RPE well enough to really drive consistent progressive overload. And there's days that, like, subjectively what a beginner might call an 8 just isn't an 8. So just telling them what should be an 8 and having them do it and then record what it actually was tends to work out a little better. That being said, there are times, especially with my more advanced athletes, that I'll program a weight range and they have a general feel for how well it's supposed to move, and so they'll select a weight within that range that'll move about how we want it to. And then on bench, oftentimes I'll have people do AMRAPs, or I'll have them do like one RIR AMRAPs. So I guess you could say that's kind of working off of RPE, but instead of doing a set and assigning an RPE afterward, or saying, okay, work up to a 7, I'm going to say do as many reps until you get to a 7 and then rack it. That's something on pressing work that I've had a lot of success with. Not super commonly utilized. I think it's a very effective way to train, especially because pressing has more day-to-day variability in strength than other things, generally speaking, especially in beginners who don't really have their nutrition process before pressing days really dialed in. What do you think of doing a minimal amount of fluff and pump accessories like direct tricep or chest work, doing a bit more volume on compounds instead? For example, most programs I've seen have 3 to 6 sets of triceps on each day. Why not just do a bit more volume on the bench? Okay, so that's a very good question, right? And like specificity loyalists might say, hey, those triceps, not useful. Generally speaking, what you're missing, right, is let's say I reach the point that I can't do much more benching at a reasonable intensity, right? There's a very good chance it's not my triceps that have failed me, but it's rather my chest. Especially in newer trainees, you're going to see the shoulders and chest fail a lot quicker than the triceps. That's kind of a general trend, right? And just because your chest is topped out and you can't do any more benching doesn't mean your triceps can't handle more, right? And some people would absolutely argue that, hey, well, specificity dictates that we got all the tricep work we're going to need from the specific motion. Why would I do extra? And I've kind of always erred on the side of caution and said, all right, but I can recover from it, and what if it is helpful, right? So it's like, I'm done pressing. My pecs are fried. And I'm like, I could do probably 3 or 4 more work sets of triceps and recover from it just fine. Why wouldn't I, right? Generally speaking, that's always been my approach. Much the same if you finish squatting, your back is fried, you're like, my quads could handle a bit more workload. I'm usually going to prescribe a bit more workload, right? So this is something that I think that even the highest specificity guys will sometimes do something like this. Like Sean Noriega will still use a belt squat to run up additional volume on his quads that his back couldn't necessarily handle. If we apply that same exact principle to benching, we can run up additional volume on our triceps that our chest may or may not necessarily be able to handle. So I hope that kind of explains it. The presumption is that 3 to 6 sets of triceps is going to be like kind of topping off what you can recover from in a sustainable fashion. And then on the other video, can you do a video on how to learn to program and how to start? That was kind of my last video. I hope that kind of answered the same questions, how to coach yourself. But learning how to coach yourself and how to coach other people is largely the same process. So I think I don't need to expand on that one too much. Serious question. My wrists bend back a lot on overhead press, and I occasionally get minor wrist pain, but nothing too bad. Keeping them straight when going heavy is virtually impossible. Set it lower in your palm so that even with your wrist cocked back, it is sitting directly above the joint. You're not going to feel much stress on the joint, and you'll be able to put stuff over your head without any pain. Your wrist cocked is only bad if the weight is over here and it's not sitting over the joint, right? Then you get that torque on your joint, but if it's directly above it, there is no torque. What makes a good client, in your opinion, and experiences with bad ones? Well, I'm not going to talk about experiences with bad ones because that just seems overly negative, and I'm not going to trash anybody. Doesn't really do anything for me. But what makes a good client? The number one thing, in my opinion, is communication, right? So I've had people who weren't necessarily the hardest workers, didn't have the best genetics, didn't have high aspirations, but they communicated well, and that just gave me more to work with. It's very, very difficult for me to work with someone who does not give me enough information, right? I really dislike programming for some people who just never give me anything to work with. Even if they're, superly genetically gifted and making great progress, I don't enjoy the process if I don't know what I'm looking at. So even if I can drive progress, I'm like, I don't know what's going on. Cause me a little bit of stress. So I guess the most important thing is regularly communicating, not over communicating, because some people do tend to do that. I don't need to know that your stomach was upset, because it verges on excuses sometimes, but communicating well, training variables and stuff, like how things feel, what adaptations you feel like you're getting from a given exercise, when an exercise isn't benefiting you. Sometimes people just don't tell me that, and they'll just stop doing it instead of just having me rotate it. That's one of those things that confuses me. But aside from that, it's the people that really have they're out, like, are working their best on the outside the gym stuff, actually listen to me. You'd be surprised how many times I tell people to do certain things. Like, they ask me, I tell them, they just don't end up doing it, which is fine. You know, people can drive their own rate of progress. Like, the amount of work you put in is going to be proportionate to what you get out, so I don't really mind. I don't never get upset about that. But the people that actually listen, I think it's cool to watch. So people who do a good job listen to me, people who do a good job with their outside the gym stuff, and also just the one that's fun is some people just know how to push themselves, or they really learn it as I'm coaching them, and that's really, really cool to watch. Whereas, like, some people they'll nail their outside the gym stuff, they'll communicate well with me, and they're like, man, I must have shit genetics. I'm not making any progress, blah, blah, blah. Like, my genetics must be bad. I'm doing a decent job with everything else. I'm following the program to a T. I have an okay coach, presuming I'm an okay coach. But sometimes that person just does not train hard, right? At the end of the day, programming and all this stuff is very cool. It can be as complicated as you want to make it. It can be, it could be a make or break for a block is how intelligent your programming is. But also, at some point, you need to train hard. Some people don't have the notion that training is supposed to be difficult sometimes. I don't understand, like, that's a bad client thing. People will be like, oh yeah, Sam, like, I made shit progress, your program is ass. I guarantee you didn't work hard. I can look at your spreadsheet and tell that you are just not pushing yourself in any fashion. Like, they'll put, like, okay, I got 12 reps on my tricep press downs at RPE 10. And I would bet $100. I barely have $100. I would bet $100 you could have done fucking 10 more if I put a gun to your head. Right? So you can't tell, that's not a 10. That's not a 10 RPE. So you're lying in the sheet. You're not pushing yourself. So if you fail to see good progress, and that's the case, that really grinds my gears a little bit. Because, like, I'm not a life coach. I'm not going to sit you down and say, all right, I know this is going to, like, blah, 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 but I think you can push yourself a little harder, and they get mad and insinuate that I'm, like, full of shit. I'm not going to do that, right? So I'm just going to be like, all right, I don't know. You're making shit progress. I like that outside my pay grade. So I guess that would be my one bad client thing. Thank you so much for answering the questions. These help so much. I'm glad to hear that. And then, what is your take on intensity versus volume? Do you believe there's a good balance of both? Well, yes. The answer is there's a good balance of both. If you do only singles, there's not enough volume to do much. If you do only high rep stuff, you're not going to be very strong. I always hear bodybuilders talk about how volume is useless. You need minimal volume and maximum intensity. Well, at least you're listening to the right bodybuilders to listen to. I think that some of them really get caught in that volume trap type deal. I think the higher intensity guys have the right way to drive progress for those of us who don't have insanely gifted hypertrophy genetics. So if you look at a bodybuilder who has great genetics, usually they're going to do pump and fluff training. Famously, Phil Heath does not train that heavy. It's just really just volume work. Even like Jay Cutler, generally a volume guy. Lee Haney, generally a volume guy. These guys who are have extremely gifted genetics are going to be able to do that, and it's probably best for them because they're not going to beat the shit out of their body, and they can drive the progress they want to see. Those of us who don't have extremely gifted genetics, that real aggressive, beat the books, high intensity thing seems to be the only way to necessitate growth if it's not something your body's predisposed to, especially if you're natural also, right? People are like, oh, you can't train that way if you're natural. If anything, you have to train that way if you're natural, because you have to apply a much larger stimulus to elicit the same adaptation that someone on steroids is going to get, hypertrophically speaking. But I feel like that is just false. I'm not familiar with the science behind it. It just seems like, so you absolutely need both, right? What they're more so saying is that, you have to realize, those guys are like, oh yeah, they only do one work set. They don't even do a down set on their hack squat. A, that's a really fucking tough work set. But B, they're also doing 4 other exercises for their quad. So it's not a one quad work set. It's probably going to be 6 to 8 per session, probably 2 sessions, right? So that's not low volume. It's low relatively speaking, but this is something that I've kind of reversed my opinion on recently. I used to be a real volume guy, plug in 1 billion sets per week. The last one pretty tough. First 2 like relatively sub-maximal-ish. And I never grew at an outstanding rate. It was only when I dialed down the number of sets that I did and ramped up the intensity of the sets that I did, that I started to see consistent weekly like muscular growth. So rather than doing like 4 sets of 10 on the hack squat, if I did one set where I took myself within 1 rep of genuine mechanical failure, which I think a lot of people just have never come close to doing that on like a hack squat. And it gets harder and harder the stronger you get, let me tell you that. Because I remember I used to be able to like take a bunch of sets to genuine mechanical failure when I first started training. I was like, man, I'm so much tougher than these bigger dudes. It takes a lot more out of you, I'll tell you that. But as soon as I started doing that, I saw a big uptick in rate of growth, right? So, junk volume is definitely a real thing, and it's something to be avoided, right? So it's like, it's a middle ground, right? So if you're a newer guy, you're not extremely large, you're not extremely strong. Would working up to 1 set of 10 to 20 on the hack squat and then leaving be enough to grow your quads like it might be for me, right? I'll be totally honest. If I did that twice a week, my quads would grow like weeds, right? Would that be enough for you to grow? No, right? And that largely is because like you're not as strong, so you're not presenting as large of a stimulus to your muscles. It's because of like supplemental factors, right? But also, the stronger you get, right, and the more efficient your nervous system gets, you can take a set further and further, right? So a set to failure for an really experienced lifter is a very, very different thing than it is for a newer guy, right? And so if you're doing different things, you're like, okay, that 1 set is bullshit. I need to do 2 back down sets probably, right? So if you came in and you did, twice a week, you came in, you did a top set, and then you did 2 back down sets, and all 6 of those were taken pretty close to mechanical failure, I would say you're definitely going to grow. Could you probably do a little bit extra? Hop and do some barbell squats beforehand, or even do some leg extensions afterward, and recover and grow extra? Probably. But I don't think the volume thresholds are quite as high as, like, if you're familiar, Mike Israetel's like guidelines. I think those are high. I think if people were actually taking their quad work within 2 or 3 reps of genuine mechanical failure like he prescribes, do not think people are going to be walking away from those weeks recovering regularly, handling whatever, like 16 sets of quads or whatever it is. Do not think most people could do that. So I think it's a little bit lower than some people are under the impression, but it's certainly not like 1 set per week or anything like that. I hope that answers your question. It's definitely a complicated one.